We're back in session. Welcome back. So, David, you had some other questions?
Should I just throw out a bunch of questions? I'll just throw them out. These are just things that came up in the testimony that I think are worth thinking about. I think Andrew probably has thought about them before, but I haven't thought about them all. Chip said, we should try to do a better job of taking into account debt service and business taxes. And last meeting, we were talking about ways of better measuring changes in the cost of mortgages. So, whatever. I don't know if there's something there. And I'm not sure what they were referring to in terms of business taxes not being properly reflected, but I thought it was worth asking the question. There's Chip also and I know that others have challenges as well. What's the right start date for the NOI chart? Is it the early 90s? Is it 2000s? Do we have some opinion as to, I understand that 1991 was the first year we had data, but is there some truth to the critique that that's misleading somehow? And so just to kind of talk that through. RSA's testimony kind of challenged whether relying on the 30% rent-to-income ratio is appropriate today, and I thought that was a reasonable question. I mean, I think probably most people would say 30% is reasonable, but they're kind of challenging that, so I thought it was worth raising. Those were the things that I pulled from their testimony that I thought were worth raising.
Well, the 30% is just the HUD standard, so
yeah. Okay.
I don't know if there's
and do we reflect that somewhere in our report that we are relying on as the HUD standard?
Yes.
Which used to be, I believe, 20,
a long time ago, it was like
20
and then 25.
25 and now 30, yeah. It's been 30 for about 15 years.
Also increasing the proportion for Section 8.
The Trump administration to make it a higher proportion. Yeah.
I think they're talking about 33 to 35% of tenants' actual income.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a whole bunch of momentum happening to the other. I think no, because for us it's too high.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In terms of business tax, I don't know how we would track that. That's individual.
Yeah, that
Each
depends
business
on your
is
business
paying
structure.
their own individual tax on that.
So is he referring, or do we know what is he referring to? What the tax on your net income is? Is that what he's?
I believe so, which is we explain is, NOI and profit are two different things, and we realize that. Net operating income is just after operating and maintenance expenses. Doesn't include debt service. It doesn't include income. We call income tax, but I guess you could say business tax or major capital improvements. So it would be part of that.
Yeah, so depending on your ownership structure, you could be paying corporation tax, or you could be paying unincorporated business tax, which, we could have a discussion about whether that's an appropriate quote-unquote expense. But it is certainly something that most owners probably a cost that most owners incur in one form or another.
But I guess I'm wondering, maybe it's not even a legitimate cost to reflect. I mean,
right?
Yeah. So I'm trying to decide whether the category has any legitimacy, and on some level, it's like that's a cost on every business. So what's the point of measuring that, whether they're in real estate or not in real estate? So is there any argument that business tax should be incorporated in our? Even if we were able to measure it, is there an argument that we should?
It's more a question for the Department of Finance for the RPIE, I think, because that's where it would have to be reflected. I mean, I don't know whether
they don't reflect that in the RPIE. I don't think it's considered a traditional operating and maintenance cost. So I don't, and I'm not even sure how we would try to capture that. But I guess we wouldn't. I'm not sure about the argument whether it is or isn't. I mean, you could look on the other side of, we report tenant income, but we don't report net income, right?
Changes in the cost of space for tenants.
No, we report the CPI, but I don't know.
I think that's
I don't know.
I think overall, like, light, like, all of those things, but, like, do we weigh it as, do we give it the same way as, like, we do the PIOC? When we make our decisions, we don't have those conversations.
And then the starting point for the NOI?
Oh, starting point for the NOI. You know, traditionally, we've seen that. In more recent reports, we've taken another example. It is a point-to-point comparison. You know, we're just taking it because that's the first reliable year of data that we have. It's a point-to-point comparison, so we always point out in the text, there's a different, you know, if you look at this point, it's this. I mean, you could look at all those different points.
But is there like, what point should we, like, what's the relevant point? So it's not, just because
I
it's
think
first.
the relevant is just looking at the graph over time, and you look at, you know, where things are going.
We also have NOI and all the other data points are there every year on the table.
So you could see what you'd like.
Every single year it's broken out individually and changes.
I mean, it's only relevant if you're trying to do some kind of cumulative thing and make a comparison. You know, like for the past, you know, what has happened in the past 15 years versus what's happened in the last 4 years. And, you know, what's relevant in terms of what's most interesting to me is that NOI has, for the last 11 years, if I'm not mistaken, gone up consistently.
12. Yeah, so I guess you could make the same argument, you know, for going back and we'll say income increase and the cost increase, and we go back to the same years, and there's no discussion about changing that necessarily, but it is point to point. I don't know if it's I guess. Do you find it misleading or?
I don't. I was just listening to the testimony and trying to, you know, which of these are potential critiques of the data that we're looking at, and just to get a better sense as to.
Will probably come up when we hear from Tim Collins, because it comes up when you you look over long periods of time at relationship between NOI and the guidelines.
Right. And the RSA in the past has said, if you start in a recession like the early 90s, that's going to distort that's the position.
I think that's the argument, yeah.
You know, and they are percentage increases. Dollar amounts are different, you know. NOI always, you know, a large double-digit increase in NOI, but in inflation-adjusted dollars, you're talking about $340 in 1990 to about looks like about $200 more now, 64%. But it's not as though it's a 64% on a rent that's, you know, the rental amount is, you know what I'm saying? So if you look at it as sort of a dollar amount instead of a percentage increase, I mean,
then it tells you what.
That's another way you can look at it, too.
But
that you've gone up.
What's your takeaway from the dollar amount analysis?
Well, sometimes percentages can show more than, you know, if you have a rise in, like a 3% rise in NOI or something, that may only translate to a $20 a month increase in NOI in a dollar amount. So people may look at dollar amounts different than percentages. Mm-hmm. So, you know, you could also sort of look at it that way, too. But I think the important thing is NOI, you know, from the data that we receive, NOI has been increasing. So I think that's the takeaway.
So, any other points for general discussion? Okay, let's see. Is Perico Williams here? Not yet?
I think we're a bit early.
Well, right, okay.
Is there anyone?
She's probably being sent to the south side, or the north side.
I don't know if this is for general discussion, but on the RSA testimony, there just seemed to be some inconsistencies. I don't know if it's a good moment to discuss.
Sure.
Here, but
We have time,
when
let's
it comes
talk about it.
Given that we have 4 minutes, paying 30% of income, he's saying in one scenario that, in one case, that it's no longer a hardship, and I think we saw that figure, especially for rent-stabilized tenants, go up over the last couple of years. And then he's saying in another paragraph that rents are still rising, incomes are rising faster than rents, which those two seem inconsistent. And then the increase in building operating costs in excess of 16%. I think he clarified with you, Kathy, that that's a year-to-year
That's a cumulative PIOC
PIOC, right?
number. And, that's what we've been told is, and if you do the math, that seems to be about right.
Right. But I think it shows, it's not an average increase over the 4 years, it's sort of a year-to-year, which seems not really what is being experienced by building owners, right?
I mean, that's taken from the price index, so it's something that was experienced by owners as measured in the price index, yeah. So that's the cumulative increase over those 4 years in expense.
Okay.
And then the only other thing I think is that they compare to just the one-year guidelines. I don't know what happens to this analysis if you take into account
I mean, you could do that.
two-year renewals.
Yeah, we produce a RGB rent index that takes into account 1 and 2 year lease renewals plus the vacancy, the median vacancy. Not anymore. It's a barely.
People are becoming rational in there.
Yeah, with the rent freezes and whatnot. I don't know. We don't know it for this HVS, but the previous HVS, I think they were a percentage or 2 points off. I think 1 year actually now surpassed the 2 year, which would reflect the rent. Even prior to that, the rent increases being smaller. I think for 1 year leases.
Yeah, on the incomes and rents, I have to figure out where these numbers are coming from and why they've picked the last 3 years as the period to look at. And I guess my observation about that from the data that we've seen is that wages are so flat that I'm just questioning whether this is correct, that incomes are rising faster than rents.
Yeah.
I have to look at the data, but it just
Last year was
intuitively.
flat. It was like 0.4, wasn't the data we saw last week like 0.4% increase?
Yeah, it may be looking at nominal versus inflation
Yeah.
adjusted.
Yeah.
Because without inflation adjustment, it would, there has been a growth in income, but we measure it with inflation.
But anyway, I don't know where these numbers are coming from. They don't tend to tell you where they source their.
Well, it's saying
Data.
housing vacancy survey.
Okay.
So I'm assuming it's taking the point to point, what it was.
But not adjusting, not inflation.
Yeah,
Yeah, no,
I'm assuming. I'd have to go back and
Okay.
look, but.
And then the paragraph above, I think that must be a typo. It should say paying more than 30% of it.
Mhm.
To be considered hardship. Right? I mean,
Yeah, and then it's like,
Yes,
what should be
it should
considered
be.
a hardship then?
It's the
30%
in his
of
opinion.
It must be, yeah. But actually, they're doing an inflation to inflation I mean, I guess the comparison of 10.9 to 8.1 nominal is a reasonable
Yeah,
comparison. If they're
that
both nominal.
sounds right, yeah. I believe, I'd have to go back and
Yeah.
figure that out.
They were, I mean, consistent with what Kathy and Rodrigo are saying, I mean, there's other inconsistencies, like they say housing conditions are better, but, the housing stock is going to deteriorate, or they said that,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
But they did say that for the first 2014, if you have a rent freeze, you'll see buildings not having heat and hot water, there's just that.
I think
I
that,
don't have evidence that that's necessarily been true.
the speaker from Rebney actually addressed that I forgot, in his testimony about how it's improving the conditions, and he gave reasons why.
Say it again, Andrew, that he's.
That I think
He's
the
saying
person-
deregulation is funding
The improvements.
the improvements. I mean, that was what I took away
And the new
from what he
building,
said.
and the new housing built under 420A.
I mean, he was making an argument for total deregulation.
I think it, well, one other inconsistency is, again, like, he does state that incomes are rising faster than rents, but then there's another part in the testimony that states that, well, then the reason it cites rent, like lower wages are actually the issue to address, and the way to address affordability as opposed to lowering the rent adjustments. And then I mean, the part that I didn't understand, I think there was this comparison to public housing with the specific part about repairs and maintenance of the building. For me, what I took away was a comparison to public housing and saying, look at the way that public housing operates, and as a result, look at the maintenance of it. And if we continue to have lower rent adjustments, then this will be the same thing. And I really just did not buy that analogy. I mean, there's just obviously a very huge difference between private ownership and lower rent adjustments and government-owned and operated
I thought
housing.
the point was just really more general, which is that if you don't invest in repairs and maintenance, that you end up with a very deteriorated housing stock. That's what I took away from it, is that it was more a general comment on, or in support of the notion that if you cut off revenue stream, which has happened to NYCHA for sure, then you end up with deteriorating stock.
And the reason why I didn't understand that is there have obviously been cuts by HUD to NYCHA, but here we've seen actual profits for most years. Whether the profits are up or down, the fact of the matter is, like, there are profits. So that part for me was a little bit difficult to make an analogy there to public housing, because it's just not the same.
Well, the analogy doesn't work if rents are actually going up in the rent-stabilized stock, because revenue is increasing, right? I don't know. Scott, you weigh in on this.
Well, the rent is based on the income, and
I mean, I think I think you're trying to make it a very literal. I think it's a more gestural comment that what kind of housing stock do we want, right? Do you want to drive it to the edge of the cliff and let it fall off the cliff, which that's the approach, unfortunately, that NYCHA has gotten to? I think that's the analogy he's making.
And you know, and to that point, I'm glad they did bring that up, because I think it speaks to a larger question of who is actually who is actually going to be able to afford and live in New York City if we actually keep increasing the rents to a high amount and they get deregulated, because it won't be as diverse as it is. And a lot of, we were speaking about business owners before, for example. I mean, even just with small business owners, I mean, I think that speaks to the question of, I mean, the comparison to public housing is one thing, but I think who's actually going to afford like $3,000 rent if your income is, say, $50,000? It just...
Our rents are on average in the low teens is the world we're talking about.
So,
We're not talking about the
well,
private sector.
well, I think Manhattan is 20, I think we had something here before where Manhattan was in the 2000s. Per borough? All right, Manhattan, 2000, well, core Manhattan. I mean, they're different for,
Which, you're looking at
I took a quick look at Table 2.
Average income.
No, we're looking at, I think
Rent.
she's saying average income or
saying-
rent. Yeah, so the average rent is 1378 citywide.
Core Manhattan is 2,000. The city without core, 1157. I think
11.
that's what
Scott's
Scott is referring
referring,
to.
I know you haven't been through the testimony yet, but this is why I stressed, when we get to the testimony, we're going to hear from people who are at 1350
I've heard from-
to 1900, and I'm sure you work with them on a day-to-day basis. So I'm just pointing out that more than 50% of the stock never comes to our hearing. It never tells us that they're in a housing crisis, never tells us that they're rent burdened, et cetera. That's all I'm pointing out. And anyone who's in the stock that's above 2,000, we don't hear from either. So I think there's very specific policy measures that we unfortunately can't deliver the right remedy to because of the way this board is structured. But there's huge gulfs that we don't hear from.
Okay. Is our speaker here?
So we're gonna actually get started with Stephanie, then Oksana, well, and then Barika. You all just want to join us, so then you guys can.
No problem. Hello. Yeah, let's go there.
Yeah.
Yeah, how about an off-site? You don't think you can get HPD to pay for us for a little retreat?
We'll put it on the internet when we talk. So can I just confirm something about the schedule? The hearing on the 21st, that's like, that's that date, that's what we published online.
Yes.
Is the full schedule published? Mm-hmm. It's all public now.
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. My name is Stephanie Rosoff. I'm the Director of Data Analytics at the NYU Furman Center.
Welcome.
On. There we go. Okay, so for those of you who are unfamiliar with the NYU Furman Center, we are a joint research center at the NYU School of Law and the NYU Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. We look and work to advance research and debate on housing, neighborhoods, and urban policy. And as a nonpartisan academic research center, we do not take a position on rent adjustments, but today I will give you an overview of renters in the city and preview some of our latest data. So every year, the Furman Center publishes a report called The State of New York City's Housing and Neighborhoods, and we're releasing this report next May, or next month rather, in May. I'm here today to preview our chapter on state of renters and their homes and some additional data to give you a sense of the latest rents and incomes and whatnot hopefully related to your previous discussion for the city and the neighborhoods. So please feel free to interrupt me with questions as I go. I'm happy to clarify anything. Okay, so I want to start by looking at household income distribution, and I'm sorry these colors are a little dark, I'm realizing on the projection screen, but the bar or the column to the left is for 2000 and the column to the right is for 2016, and this is showing households by income adjusted for inflation between 2000 or in 2000 and in 2016. And as you can see, between 2000 and 2016, there are more households at either end of the income distribution. So we, as a share, we've gained more lower income households and more higher income households. You can see the big jump for households earning over $250,000 and a decline in the middle. So I wanted to show this slide to set the stage for the income distribution in the city. And so now I'm going to look at real median renter household income. So renter household incomes are less than for incomes overall in the city. And so we can see that between 2015 and 2016, real median renter income increased by about 4.6%. And I want to caution here that this includes all renters in the city. So as higher income folks become renters, that's going to push up the real median renter income. So this doesn't necessarily mean that there are fewer lower income households renting. You can see there's quite a bit of variation between the boroughs and the city overall. So the dashed line is for New York City, and then the other lines are for the boroughs. So we can see that incomes have gone up generally since 2006 and since the crash, but have not, the rates vary a lot by borough. And so next, we're going to turn to looking at rents. So this is median gross rent adjusted for inflation, again, for New York City and for each of the boroughs. And we can see that rents have gone up for, between 2006 and 2016 across all the boroughs. And this happened the most, so the rate of increase was highest in Brooklyn and Manhattan between these time periods. And so in this next slide, what I'm showing is the percent change in income and the percent change in rent on the same graph. And so the blue line here shows median gross rent, and then the green line shows median renter household income, and these are indexed to 100 in 2006, and everything is adjusted for inflation. And so we can see that there was a big jump, a relatively big jump in median renter household income between 2015 and 2016, so there has been some improvement there. But also, as you can see on the graph, the gap has not closed. So rents have still climbed at a much higher rate than household income, even with the gains in income over the last couple of years.
I know it's sourced, but just for my understanding,
Sure.
how do we define median gross rent? Is that what they're actually paying, or how's that defined?
That is defined as contract rent plus utilities. And it's supposed to be, so if a household is receiving a voucher, for example, it is supposed to be the total rent. It's not asking about how much of their income goes to rent, it's what the rent is plus utilities.
Stephanie, just real median renter income, is that adjusted gross income? What is that number?
That number is household income, total household income for renter households.
And is household income your adjusted gross income or your gross income, or?
You mean adjusted for inflation?
I just did my taxes and I'm forgetting.
Pre-tax, this is pre-tax income.
So total income.
Total income, yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
But in that, if the household gets subsidies, it's in the income or not in the income?
If they get, I believe, if they get a housing subsidy, that would not be in their income. But if they get Social Security payments, for example, that would be counted as income.
Okay.
Great. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to a different measure of rent. So this is median asking rent, and this data comes from StreetEasy. And so what this shows is the median rent for listing. So if you were on the private market and you were looking for an apartment or a unit in New York City, this is the median rent for each of these community districts. And as you can see on the map, most expensive, more than $3,000 median listing rent in Manhattan, parts of Manhattan. The lowest cost areas were in the Bronx. But there is a lot of variation. But median asking rents are significantly higher than median rents in the previous slides. Part of that is because median rent, as measured by the American Community Survey, that's counting all households, so that includes public housing residents and others in all sorts of housing situations, whereas median asking rent is reflective of kind of what's on the market now on the private market. Okay. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit more about rental affordability. And again, I'm sorry for the colors here. They're kind of washed out on this slide. But basically, this figure is looking at the share of renter households that were rent burdened. And we define that in two categories. One is moderately rent burdened. So that's spending between 30 and 50% of pre-tax income on rent. And then severely rent burdened households spend more than half of their pre-tax income on rent. And so the bottom portion of these bars, if you can see the color difference there, those are the severely rent burdened households, and the top portion are the moderately rent burdened households. And the total height of the bar is what we would consider the rent burden share, the total rent burden share of households in New York City. And so this is cut up by income, and so we're using the HUD definitions here. And as you can see, most households of extremely low and very low income are rent burdened. Those shares haven't changed a whole lot between 2006 and 2016, but you do see significant shifts in the low and moderate and middle income households. So for households making a bit more money, the share of those households that are rent burdened has increased.
Does this slide ever get overlaid with the types of housing these groups live in?
So you mean what do you mean by that?
Stabilized versus market rate versus...
This is all households. This is all households.
State-owned housing.
This is everything in one. Yeah, great. Okay, and so an additional affordability measure that we like to use is the share of recently available rental units that were affordable to households at different points in the income distribution. And so on the left, we have the 2006 bar, and on the right, we have the 2016 bar. And essentially, this is saying what share of units that were that turned over tenants in the last year were affordable to these income groups. And again, you can see that very little of the recently turned over housing stock was affordable to extremely low and very low income households in both 2006 and 2016. And slight declines, but what's most notable is that for low-income households and moderate-income households, the share of units that were affordable declined quite a bit in the last decade.
Does this take into account, so does the affordable units take into account like public housing and Section 8? So
that's everything in there.
Everything is in there.
Yep.
Thank you.
So what we do, just in the data weeds a little bit, but what we do is we know from the American Community Survey if a household moved in the last 12 months, and then we know what they're paying in rent. And so we use that as a proxy to determine what the recently available rents are. Okay, and then we also, as part of our renter chapter, look at the use of Section 8 housing vouchers, and I wanted to show this map to just demonstrate just the variety or the variation amongst neighborhoods. So tenants using housing choice vouchers, and these are Section 8 vouchers, were concentrated in areas with the lowest housing costs, including parts of the Bronx, Staten Island, and the Rockaways. And in 2016, in the Bronx, 13.8% of occupied privately owned rental units had tenants who used housing choice vouchers, compared to just 2.5% in Queens. And so there is a lot of variation in where Section 8 housing choice vouchers are located. Households that use those vouchers are located, I should say. And then we also look at the vacancy rate as part of the chapter. We use the American Community Survey, which is, I'm sure as you know, different from the HVS. But we, let's see, in 2016, the ACS rental vacancy rate was about 3.6%, and generally it's averaged about 3.7% over the decade. And then finally, I want to end with a slide, and again, and sorry, it's hard to tell with the colors, from our State of New Yorkers chapter that looks at homeless shelter population since 1990. And so the bottom portion of the bar is persons and families, and the top portion of the bar is just individuals alone. And between 2016 and 17, the average monthly homeless shelter population increased about 2% citywide, which is a slower rate of growth than in previous years. So that's encouraging. But despite this, there were an average of 62,000 New Yorkers, including 24,000 children in homeless shelters, on average in the city in 2017, up 76% since 2007. So quite a big jump. And those are some of the findings we have from our report, and I'm happy to answer additional questions. Got it.
Okay, questions?
But I think that, like, and this is why I asked the Furman Council to come to answer some of the questions that you had about, like, what is applicable, what's happening in New York City. So, like, I think that it does include all of the Section 8 data, which I think we were just discussing whether we should include or not. But I do feel like that is all income that landlords are getting, and what is the state of what's happening in housing. I think it's reflective of, like, some of the data that we're looking at, and I think it's just kind of reiterating some of the conversations we had earlier.
That's it. Good, great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Oksana Mironova, and I'm a housing policy analyst with the Community Service Society, which, if you're not familiar with, is an anti-poverty organization here in the city. I don't have any slides, but I do have copies of my written testimony that I'm going to pass around. So as those are going around, I am going to read my written testimony, and I have a couple of figures that I'm hoping we can all look at together. And if you have any questions about the data sourcing or my analysis, please just interrupt me. I'm happy to answer questions as I'm going. The decisions of the Rent Guidelines Board are among the most important factors influencing the well-being of the hundreds of thousands of low-income households who live in rent-regulated apartments. As illustrated in Chart 1, more low-income New Yorkers live in rent-regulated apartments than in any other type of housing in New York City. So that includes HUD-subsidized, public, Mitchell-Lama housing. And when CSS talks about low income, we're talking about households who are making at about 200% of the federal poverty level, which is $39,000 for a family of 3. Further, with the launch of Where We Live New York City, the city's comprehensive fair housing planning process, it's important to consider the rent-regulated stock from a fair housing perspective. As stated in a recent report published by Council Member Brad Lander's office, rent regulations are an underappreciated but perhaps most important policy for a diverse city. Strong rent regulations enable low and moderate income tenants to stay in the neighborhoods as rents rise, a critical policy to preserve integrated neighborhoods, especially as gentrification continues to roll across New York City. As of 2014, which is the date for latest data that we have available, approximately 65% of the rent-regulated housing stock was occupied by people of color.
Does rent regulated include public housing?
No, I'm just talking about rent stabilized and rent controlled.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm going to move on to the city's growing economy and simultaneous wage stagnation. The RGB's 2018 Income and Affordability Study registers many positive economic indicators, including a declining unemployment rate and rising employment levels. However, the study also reports the stagnation of inflation-adjusted wages over the past 2 years. This recent trend of both rising employment and stagnating wages may be partially explained by the fact that the city's long-term economic growth has been concentrated in low-wage sectors. A recent report by the Comptroller's Office has found that while the city's economy has grown and diversified since 2000, the growth has largely occurred in low-paying jobs. As shown in chart 2 below, the number of low-paying jobs grew by 39% between 2000 and 2016, outpacing middle and high-paying job growth. Further, analysis of the 2016 ACS shows that many low-income workers are in industries that have minimal opportunities for long-term career development. 44% of low-income employed residents in New York City hold jobs in service and retail industries with median annual earnings of just $15,000. The Comptroller's report concludes that despite employment level growth, the city's economy continues to be volatile for many workers, and that wages for low and middle income New Yorkers will likely continue to stagnate into the future.
Could I ask a question just about the slide? Just that number for low-paying jobs increasing 40%, it just seems so, it's just hard for me to visualize what that means for New York City. Like, what does that mean? Like,
in what do you mean? In what sense?
I'm assuming that's a very high base number of, like, the number of low-paying jobs in New York City in 2000 was probably like in the millions, I would guess. But they've gone up 40%, and the people taking those jobs are new New Yorkers or unemployed New Yorker. Like, that's a massive growth over a really large base. And so I just can't visualize where all those jobs are and who took them.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I can't answer that off the top of my head, but I'm happy to get back to you on that.
Thank you.
If that helps, yeah. Given this context, so the context of the growth of low-wage jobs, it is unsurprising that the number of low-income households in New York City is staying at about the same level, even as the city's population continues to grow. As shown in Table 1, between 2000 and 2016, New York City has experienced rapid growth in both population and the number of households. Both trends are likely to continue through the next decade. Over the same time period, the number of low-income households has remained about at the same level, which is like a little bit over 1 million, while the number of homeless families nearly tripled, which you've talked about as well. According to homeless advocacy groups like Picture the Homeless and Coalition for the Homeless, as well as the city's own research recently, the city's homelessness crisis is directly tied to the growing housing affordability gap, driven in no small part by increasing rents. Rent-regulated tenants have more protections than unregulated tenants, in part thanks to the RGB. However, the Independent Budget's Office analysis showed that 43% of households entering the shelter system between 2002 and 2012, which is the latest data that we have available, unfortunately, were coming from rent-regulated apartments. Now I'm going to move on to some data that we now have because the 2017 HVS is available, or the summary of the HVS is available. The rent-regulated housing stock offers an increasingly important reprieve to the city's low-income tenants as housing costs continue to rise. Data included in 2017 HVS points to rapidly increasing market rate rents, likely spurred by both a broader economic recovery and public economic development efforts. As illustrated in Chart 3, median asking rents increased by 29.9% above inflation between 2014 and 2017. And this is data for all housing types. For comparison, when looking at the changes between 2011 and 2014, the asking rents just went up by 2.1% above inflation. Is illustrated in Chart 4. The number of apartments renting for over $2,000 increased by about 100,000, while the number of apartments renting for under 1,000 decreased by 88,000. So that's also between 2014 and 2017. Further, the apartments renting for over 2,000 make up a larger market share overall. With an influx of higher income households and a declining number of low rent units, there is increased competition for the fewer low priced units within the market. Between 2014 and 2017, the median income for rent-stabilized tenants rose quicker than the rate of inflation by 7%. However, it's possible that this increase is indicative of an influx of higher income tenants into the housing stock, and then into the rental market in general. Despite rising incomes, the median rent-to-income ratio has not budged for the third HVS in a row since 2011, and is at 31.3%, meaning that half of the rent-stabilized tenants in the city are still rent-burdened.
I'm sorry, so just in that paragraph, you say it is possible that this increase is indicative of an influx of higher income tenants. So what's the What should we take from that possibility? What is the relevance that you ascribe to that?
Well, so HVS is a point-in-time survey, so it's not longitudinal. So we can't say that the rising incomes within the housing stock are due to the fact that tenants within those apartments are making more money. It could be because they're actually getting displaced by higher income tenants. But we can't, with the data, with this type of data, we really can't say either way. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we could take from the HVS about the kind of the recent decisions by the RGB. RGB's consideration of the tenant's economic situation is measurable by the latest HVS figures. The median rent for stabilized apartments rose by 2.6% above inflation between 2014 and 2017. In comparison, median rents in unregulated apartments rose by 10% above inflation. This has had an impact on low-income New Yorkers living in regulated apartments. In 2017, as part of Community Service Society's annual Unheard Third survey, we asked low-income renters to rank how much of a problem affording the rent was for their household. Their share of regulated renters reporting a problem with affordability decreased by 13% from 2015. In comparison, their share of unregulated renters reporting a problem did not show a significant change. And the chart is on the next page. RGB's decisions have a real impact on the well-being of low-income tenants in the city. Over the past few years, the board has taken this into account. Ultimately, this board must find a way to institutionalize this practice of setting guidelines that reflect changes in both tenants' costs, but also, in landlords' costs, but also in tenants' incomes. Between 2015 and 2016, the citywide net operating income for rent-stabilized buildings increased for the 12th year in a row by 4.4%. Many neighborhoods with high concentrations of both low-income tenants and rent-stabilized buildings saw much higher increases in the NOI. For example, the NOI in Inwood, Washington Heights increased by 14.9%. It increased by 17.6% in Morrisania, Melrose, and Claremont, and by 10.7% in Ocean Hill, Brownsville. At the same time, as part of CSS's Unheard Third survey, we asked renters if they would be able to afford to stay in their apartments if their rent increased by just $25 per month, which is comparable to a 2% increase of the median cost of a rent-stabilized apartment in 2017. Half of low-income regulated tenants said that they would not. With stagnating wages, diminished low-rent housing stock that leaves tenants with minimal choices if they're priced out of their rent-regulated apartments, and evidence that RGB decisions have a measurable impact on the well-being of low-income New Yorkers, we recommend a rent freeze for this coming year. So that's all. Does anyone have any more questions?
There's two data points that you have, and I just wasn't sure how to place them in the context of New York. You say, as of 2014, approximately 65% of the rent-regulated housing stock was occupied by people of color. What is the figure for New York City overall?
I think it's about comparable, but I would have to double check on that. I think, yeah.
And then when you said the number of people entering the shelter system, 43% came from rent-regulated apartments, and what percentage of households live in rent-regulated apartments overall?
46. But
it's also about roughly the same.
Yeah, but my point there was that because the rent-regulated apartments obviously offer more protections against rent increases and provide the protection of tenure that unregulated tenants don't have. So without knowing the statistics, my assumption would be that the number of homeless people coming out of rent-regulated apartments would be lower, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
If it's driven by rent as opposed to by loss of job or loss of income.
Right, yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so let's move on to the next speaker. Thank you.
You're good. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
My name is Perico Williams. I'm the Deputy Director at the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development. ANHD is 44 years old, I believe. We are the umbrella group that serves all of the neighborhood-based nonprofits that are affordable housing developers, managers, and work with tenants across the city. We have more than 100 groups, and they have developed over 100,000 affordable housing units in the past 25 years, and directly operate over 30,000 affordable units. So I would just, oh, do you need?
Another one? I'm sorry.
Oh, actually, I just scribbled on it, sorry. I was just, as they were doing things, I was like, I can skip some of this section so you guys don't have to hear repeats. But so just to be clear, our ANHD, our members and our groups are both tenant advocates, builders, and managers, right? So we think very intensively about making sure that buildings cash flow, because we also don't want to be in a position of putting any of our tenants in a precarious situation, right? So I'm going to skip some of the stuff on HVS because Oksana covered that, and I don't want to be repetitive in any way, shape, or form. I think the only thing that I would highlight, I would just highlight a couple of things for you all in terms of the HVS and its initial findings that it might, I think might also sort of touch on some of the stuff that Oksana mentioned. One is that the city's entire increase in vacancy rate is made up by the private unregulated stock. So actually the vacancy rate in the rent stabilized stock has maintained steady / dropped. We can't exactly know that it's statistically significant because we don't have the raw data yet, but all of the increase in the vacancy rate is entirely in the private unregulated stock. So I think that that's one thing that's important to flag. It's not like all of the city has more rental units and sort of more space in terms of vacancy. It's a very particular part. And then I think the only other thing that I would highlight is that the median monthly rent of rent stabilized units, which is about $1,269, aligns pretty closely with the median income for New York City renter households, which puts, based on median income, puts them about $1,200. So even the median income of rent stabilized stock is slightly above the overall median income for New York City, but it is the closest housing stock we have in terms of incomes to rents. So as we continue to sort of push the rent stabilized rent number up, we move not just our rent stabilized market, but the overall city market higher and higher beyond the median income of New Yorkers. So I'm gonna jump into sort of talking about some of the development side of things. So ANHD and our nonprofit community development members have had a history of, this is now middle of page 2, if you have had a history of keeping and operating our businesses, our buildings, rents low to minimize tenant rent increases while maintaining safe and quality buildings. They do this while operating 100% affordable buildings, right? So this is a commitment of 100% affordability, maintaining a building that cash flows, and maintaining a quality building stock. And they do so without the added revenue of a mixed income building that has market rate units. And this is true for both our smaller sized organizations that operate as few as a couple to a dozen buildings, all the way up to our larger development and management members, which have portfolios of over 1,500 units. So I think this touches on some of the scale of what it means to be a smaller landlord versus a larger landlord. As operators of low and moderate rent level housing, ANHD's members utilize a number of different programs that allow them to make the needed repairs, maintenance, and building upkeep, while also ensuring sound building finances without burdening tenants. These programs that I'm going to outline are accessible to all rent-regulated building owners. Go ahead.
Yeah, just on the previous paragraph, you say that your not-for-profit members have a history of keeping operating expenses in their buildings low. Is there data on that, like kind of what average operating expenses are for your members, or do you know what categories they're able to keep lower than for-profit landlords?
I don't have specific data on that. I could go back and ask one of my colleagues for more specific data. I mean, I think part of this is they have to keep their operating expenses lower in order to maintain the affordability levels. We know through analysis of local law 44 data, which is sort of pulls together all of the affordable housing analysis. This is subsidized housing, not NYCHA, not necessarily project-based Section 8 units, that on average, nonprofit buildings have lower affordability levels and lower rent levels than buildings that are affordable housing units but not run by nonprofits. So they're already starting with like a lower rent roll than everybody else. And obviously then they have to operate with a lower amount of operating costs and sort of maintain everything. But I can try and find that out.
Yeah, if you have any information on operating costs for that sector, that would be helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So all of these programs that we're going to talk about, I'm just going to go through them quickly, are accessible to all the rent-regulated buildings, both for-profit and nonprofit. And there are resources for smaller buildings with less than 20 units as well as for larger buildings. So there really is a diverse set of programs that folks can tap into. It does require going through the process of working with government, but it is a resource there for buildings for some of these exact purposes. So the HPD offers for moderate and major renovations of occupied buildings programs that include Article 8A loan program, which is for rehabilitation loans for the upgrading or replacement of major building systems with an emphasis on energy items. The PLP, the Participation Loan Program, which provides city capital for federal home funds combined with bank financing for participating private lenders at a 1% interest for moderate or substantial rehabilitation of building systems. So this is like structural improvements, modernization of apartment interiors. Similarly, the Small Buildings Loan Program provides loans from the same sources for moderate to gut rehab for small buildings of 1 to 20 units. So this is really showing that there are things for small landlords out there. And then likewise, the Small Owner Repair Program provides 10-year forgivable loans for limited systems replacements and other key repairs to small building owners of 3 to 20 units to address critical building-wide issues. There's the J51 program, which provides a 34-year or 14-year exemption for increase in real estate taxes, resulting in the rehabilitation work and tax abatements that reduce existing real estate taxes. And I think this is particularly critical given that in this year's PIOC, one of the things that changed the most was taxes. But there are programs out there for buildings who are seeing a large tax increase or who feel like one of the things that they're struggling with are taxes. There are resources that they can then tap into. And then, of course, the certified reasonable cost, 8 to 13% or 12% of the certified reasonable cost of the work each year. Right? So as I said, like all of these programs are both for-profit and nonprofit for rent-regulated buildings. It's a lot of program and jargon, and there's some folks at HPD who can probably walk you through the details and the nitty-gritty of each program a little bit better than I can. But it is to say that there are resources out there for landlords who are looking to make significant building systems or apartment or structural improvements to their buildings. So sort of touching on to switching over to the PIOC, I know that this plays a key role in how this board evaluates the building costs and the potential rent increases. I think it's important to note that even a modest change in the rent will have increase to a huge expense for the tenant. So what feels like small and slight increases of this board have significant and substantial ramifications for tenants. We do applaud this board and the staff and the team that worked with you all a couple of years ago who went back and revised and looked at patterns from the INE study and made revisions to the PIOC in 2015. But I would note that even in RGB's own report in 2014, the conclusion was that the INE data provides a superior historical estimate of changes of O&M cost for all stabilized units than the PIOC does, right? So these are numbers, these are calculations, these are estimates, these are projections that continually have to be evaluated, reconsidered, and recalibrated, which is not unlike anything that happens in data, right? So at this point in time in the HVS, we actually can't take the summary findings of 2017 and compare them to 2014 because they have retweaked and retooled how they are calculating rent stabilized numbers so that they're better and cleaner and more efficient. And so this is part of the ongoing analysis both of data and building level data and building expenses and data in general. I think I think one thing that's concerning always for us is that there's the suggestion that the changes in owners' operating costs, like changes in PIOC, either reported or projected, should be matched by increased changes to rents and or changes to tenants in their rents. And this provides a guarantee of profits, not a preservation of building conditions and management levels. So if every time a change in expenses equals a necessary change in tenant rents, that is not necessarily mimicking the market, right? And if you're looking at many of the things that are being reported in the market rate conditions right now, we're seeing a lot of reports for market rate and luxury buildings of decreased rents, why did I just forget the word? Where they're offering concessions and various incentives for rents. And so actually, right now, the market rate rent is decreasing their rents because they're seeing less demand for their rent levels, right? And so I think that's important to take into consideration as you're thinking about what is happening in the broader market in New York City and how that relates to what is happening in the rent stabilized market. And so I will also just touch on, this is not in my testimony, but I've heard it mentioned a couple of times in the questions and comments of that have come up while other folks were going. So I just want to flag that I think there's been some questions about how to include and how to think about Section 8 tenants and Section 8 data, sources of income, SSI, things like that. And I want to sort of, I'm not a lawyer, but remind and reiterate this board that we are also in a city where source of income is a protected class under the Housing Rights Commission. And so what form of where your income comes from is not actually a consideration. New York City has a source of income protection. That is something that is being discussed statewide, but whether or not your household income or how you combine to create your income to pay in rent comes from only income from an employer, wages, tips, childcare, vouchers, SSI, et cetera, is not something that you are not supposed to be discriminated against in any way for those types of reasons. I don't know a better way to say it, so maybe one of you guys can chime in. But I just want to sort of remind everybody that how you come to your household income and then pay your rent, unless it's by a legal means, I guess, is really supposed to be blind. So yeah. So in general, to wrap up, I mean, I think the 2011, 2014, and 2017 HVS found that over half of New York City renters were rent burdened, paying more than 30% of your income. And almost a third of New Yorkers were severely rent burdened. So this is some of the stuff that the Furman Center was reporting on, that Stephanie was saying. We believe that it is imperative that we protect the city's stock of affordable housing, and core to that is the city's rent-regulated stock. The housing vacancy rate continues to decrease in rent-stabilized stock and sort of increase, I guess, overall. And tenants' rental obligations continue to increase, resulting from, unfortunately, high rent-to-income ratios. So we are seeing greater rent burden in rent-regulated stock than we are in the rest of the city. And this year is a critical time to minimize any rent increases for tenants and really think about ensuring that the rent increases are as low as possible to make sure that we are not unduly burdening tenants. So thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the pulse that you're getting from your developer and owner members. So, and it's great to hear that they're taking advantage of all the loan and tax exemption programs, but would they support this testimony? So they're feeling like they can continue to make it with no to low rent increases in the coming year, 2 years?
So we have 100+ members in very different places, very different markets, and very different buildings. And so it's always an interesting conversation that we have with them around this, right? And in some ways, like what we have in our membership is very much reflected with who comes before this board, right? We've got folks who have 6 units, and that's their entire portfolio. What we repeatedly hear year after year is that they want us, ANHD, on behalf of them to push for whatever is lowest possible. That they are not looking for ways to, like, in a sense, what's the neutral way to say this, they know that their tenants are in precarious situations, right? And that increases to their tenants often lead to people leaving, to turnover, and to homelessness, which then means that while a tenant might be not in their unit anymore, they are now at their doorstep for other services, right? They also do think about and do have to keep in mind that, like, they have to run a building, right? And that takes costs and that takes expenses. And if there was ever a year where they were like, we can't do this, I feel like we would hear that. But we have not heard that this year.
So to be clear, you're not pushing for 0 or rollback, just the lowest percentage increase, is that?
That's what we normally say.
No to 0.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Other questions or comments? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, we have one more. Yeah, in case there's any additional. But I do think that the landlord panel earlier had mentioned that we shouldn't be taking 30% as like the base of what it needs to be, like the guidelines. And so I would be interested to hear from you all if you think that that's an accurate portrayal of like what the baseline for burden and severely burdened tenants of like what they pay on average of their income at 30%. And so if any of you want to address that, I think Tim can talk about it if you have any additional things to add. You can join us at the table.
Okay. Let them speak to that. The 30% threshold, is that affordable?
So I don't, it's hard to say what's the right amount of income to spend on rent. I just want to point out that 30% really varies by income, right? So if you make $500,000 a year, I don't know that we care if you're spending 50% of your income on rent. But if you make $15,000 a year, $20,000 a year, 30% is, you don't have a lot left over after paying rent. So it really, that's why we like to cut our rent burden figures by income level, because that's what's most important. It's not at the higher level, it's when you're at the lower level. It's about how much do you have left over to pay for food, to pay for, any number of other things besides rent you need for your family.
I guess I can say on this, I think it's interesting that the conversation is potentially with the proposal that it should be higher. So I'm just coming off of a 10,000 plus person conference, a citywide policy link. And one of the things that has come up is that the HUD number is really uniform across the country. And that 30% threshold sort of holds true nationwide. There is the difference in our housing market compared to other places is already baked in a little to how we think about AMIs and affordable housing. Like, we're a high-cost city, and so AMIs area median incomes get adjusted because of that. But there is a lot of discussion about the fact that high-cost markets, not just in terms of housing, but in terms of everything, should potentially be evaluated down, because the cost of food and other essential services in a city like New York is not necessarily proportionally flat across other places, right? So I know for me, there are other places that I travel to where something at a grocery store is significantly cheaper than it is here. And so there's some question about whether or not that number actually would be evaluated down in a city like New York, not up. But I think in lieu of that, it is the standard and uniform number that is used nationwide, and to sort of adjusting anything up from that, the general sense is that it really puts families in a precarious situation where you're asking them to cut health costs, medical costs, potential education costs, and cut food and cut in other places.
Thank you. Mr. Collins.
Thank you.
Welcome.
It's good to be back. My name is Tim Collins. I used to be the executive director of the board and actually prepared the introductory briefing materials that you've read, and I apologize for the length.
Great.
I want to say it's always a pleasure to come before the board. It's a scramble. I was in court this morning. I have to update my materials. What you have, most of you have seen before. It's almost verbatim what has been submitted in various incarnations over the last 4 years or so. And I'll get into explaining it later. It's somewhat updated. I did ask the staff to check it this year. There was a glitch from a couple of years ago that threw my numbers off, and they somewhat painfully but thankfully corrected me on it. And so I believe these are good numbers in the chart at the end. But let me just say a couple of prefatory things. First of all, we tend to ignore some of the greatest successes that happen in this country because most of the time success is uneventful. It's boring. I think probably the greatest example is, the First Amendment, the free exercise and no establishment clauses have kept this country relatively peaceful on the issue of religion for 230 years. But we don't stop and go, oh, wow, we're not killing each other over religion here. It's, there are minor skirmishes and disputes, but it is a monumental accomplishment. But there are no significant events around it which we, remind us to celebrate it. I think, on perhaps a much lesser scale, this board is a significant accomplishment. When I started in the late 1980s, the board didn't have comprehensive data on housing costs. We had to rely on the price index of operating costs, which we knew was faulty then, and which was proven to be faulty later. In order to get some realistic understanding of how price changes were occurring, we were going to the Attorney General's office and pulling out the filings in co-op conversions to see what their income and expense profiles look like. It was a very poor and limited surrogate for what we really needed. So watershed year was 1990 when we finally got access to the income and expense data with the Department of Finance, which of course is been very helpful. And since then, through the staff, which has always done excellent work, and through the board's expansion, looking at new issues and new items, you have a really good comprehensive base of information on which to evaluate whether rent should go up or down and by how much. And so I think that the staff reports are solid, they're comprehensive, you get plenty of information on that. And I think that speaking to the issues of affordability, you've heard about that. There's no question that there's a continuing affordability crisis. So the number of homeless at near record levels, the rent burdens, and I heard 31%. I don't know if that was from the American survey or was that? I saw 36% at some point.
That's gross.
Gross? Okay,
Yeah,
36%. And, in terms of the reality of people's households. Now, it's clear that affordability is an issue. It's clear that there are a very significant section of renters out there who are having a hard time. I don't really approach this from an affordability perspective. One could say that I'm sure that King George III often complained about how all the colonists wanted, who were, creating all of this havoc over in the 13 colonies, were complaining about taxes. And I'm sure that was a major impetus for the American Revolution. They had to pay for the French and Indian Wars. They didn't want to do it. But we all sort of rationalize, we look more deeply at our agendas and try and figure out, does this make sense? Is this logical? In the case of the colonists, they said, wait, we don't have representation in Parliament. We think this is abusive. We're being kind of kicked around without any accountability. So in the case of rent regulation, you know, there were riots in Harlem in the 1940s, which were an impetus for the Office of Price Control at a federal level to initiate rent control in the first place. There was a lot of complaints occurring in the unregulated sector in the late 1960s, and also some instability, which led to the adoption of rent stabilization. There's no question that affordability is the pain that people feel that makes them react to say, hey, do something about this. But when a legislature takes that pain and that constituent input and looks at it and says, well, you know, why should we do this? Why not, you know, limit the price of bread and you know, hold down the price of gas and that sort of thing. The reason why you're able to regulate rents is because we have a distorted market. And it's distorted for a number of reasons. It's distorted in some ways just demographically because so many people come into the city. It's a port of entry. It's distorted in many ways because there are artificial limits on supply. In order to maintain the quality of life in the city, there's very strict zoning. There are strict regulations. We have a lot of high-rise buildings, great concerns about safety and habitability. All of these things raise the cost of housing. They limit the supply of housing. In addition to which, taxpayers have made huge investments to make it a very, you know, livable and desirable place to live. Have fabulous green spaces in Central Park and so many other things. We have great educational institutions. We have a phenomenal system for delivering water and removing waste from the city, although people in Alabama may not agree with that this week. But the thing is that there are a number of inputs, many of them driven by taxpayers, which both limit supply and raise demand. And coupled with the other things that are going on in the city in terms of you know, people coming in from abroad and from other states, putting pressure on the housing market, we have this chronic problem with a low vacancy rate. And it's not a coincidence or an arbitrary legislative determination that the existence of rent regulation is related to the vacancy rate. If in fact we had a vacancy rate that was 6 or 7%, or 8% like it's been in the rest of the country for most of the time, I don't think we could talk fairly about tenants who have affordability problems and ask landlords to bear that burden, because the problem of high rents would not be driven by a distorted or a skewed market. And the bottom line is that landlords in this city benefit from a smorgasbord of institutional, government-related, taxpayer-supported, and other things that create a privileging and indirect subsidies for their interest. So, for example, you know, you look at a brownstone up in the 80s, which I examined at one point. It went up 73-fold in value from the 1940s. There were 6 apartments in there, well, 7 in all, 1 occupied the owner. 3 of those apartments were rent stabilized, 3 were market. The difference in rents was about $1,000 a month. I think the rent regulated ones were going, at the time, this is around 2007-8, they were going for about $1,500. The unregulated ones were going $2,500 to $3,000. Nonetheless, the value of that building greatly outstripped inflation, 7 or 8-fold. It rose more than double the value of real estate nationwide, and it beat the stock market. And yet the owner went to court, federal court, saying the fact that I have to keep my rents low for these 3 rent-regulated tenants means that you're taking my property. In other words, the marketplace is a neutral baseline, and any deviation from the marketplace is taking my property. Now that argument works in some markets. It doesn't work in the housing market in New York City. It assumes that the marketplace is a neutral and even playing field, and it's not. So there's the idea of a market being neutral is something you describe as this fallacy of status quo neutrality. It's not. It's deeply distorted. And the idea that owners should have a right to charge any rent that the market will bear rests upon a really horribly myopic and cruel assumption that they should benefit from all of these other distortions which increase the values of their property. So here we are. We have a rent stabilization system born out of legislative compromise, much of it imperfect, and you have a board which I think has made very solid efforts over the last 4 years. And I have to tell you, I've been around this process for a long time, and prior to this board, under the de Blasio administration, I'll be very blunt about it, things that were going on that bordered on criminal neglect. There were rent increases that had no basis in reality at all. And in fact, the board knew it. There were instances where there were projections and numbers that were raised totally legitimately and in good faith, but were discovered to be in error in later years. And when it was brought to that board's attention, they ignored it and they plowed ahead with high rent increases anyway. And it came to the point where I was starting to get shrill and losing my temper to some degree at public meetings. And I frankly didn't like making those kinds of presentations, but I realized at that point I was not engaged in a rational process of presenting data and information. I was engaged in an ideological war. The board wanted to extricate the city from rent regulation, and it took whatever deliberate steps it could to get there. And over the last 4 years, that stopped. Now, I had hoped earlier on we would have seen some modest rollbacks, and I had advocated for those. And I think that, I don't want to say I told you so, but I think that, the successive number of substantial increases in net operating income after adjusting for inflation shows that indeed, even with the lower rents that were adopted, in some cases a freeze, they were inadequate to kind of, put the brakes on so that things were stabilized. Rents are still going up at too fast a rate. So now you have a 4.5% price index. I think you should ignore it completely, and I've said that. I mean, it's there. We all know that costs are going up, but it is so overwhelmed by the long-term data, which shows that tenants have experienced excessive rent increases. And the whole point of this chart, and it's actually a very conservative one if you look at the last page of what I handed out. In the last two columns, or the first two of the last three columns, rather, if you look at the bottom, necessary rent increases. This is a conservative approach. It's not necessary rent increases to cover dollar for dollar cost increases experienced by owners. It's necessary increases to cover those costs and protect net operating income from the effects of inflation. Now, nothing is perfect, but this is about the closest I can get to that number. And I believe that should be the target of this board, but...
Can I ask you a question on that?
Yeah.
So why, we were having this conversation, and this is an issue that's been raised by landlords on just the 2 years that I've been on the board, but the claim made is that 1990 was the depths of a recession, and why is that the right base year? Why should our goal be to kind of hold landlords in the same position as they were in 1990? Why is that a legitimate policy goal?
The landlords will often pick the dots that they want to connect in a way that serves their arguments, and I'm just going to be blunt about it. You can look, and everybody does that. Everybody rationalizes to a degree. Let me answer. And the question is it being approached comprehensively and in good faith? I'm not perfect, but I really try to do my best here. The fact is, the best evidence that we have is that at the outset of rent regulation, when the pre-war stock was the bulk of the stock coming out of rent control and into stabilization, and there were some 400,000 or 500,000 units of newly stabilized units, the average operating cost to rent ratio at that point, using very conservative estimates, was about 62 cents on a dollar, okay? Leaving about 38 cents for net operating income. The other fact is that from what I know, and I mentioned in this submission that I would hope that the staff would look at this more closely, is that the housing stock has aged over the years. And based upon general indicators from the studies I'm familiar with, as a housing stock ages, it requires more maintenance, and generally those operating cost to rent ratios creep up. So that in the late 60s, the operating cost to rent ratios for the pre-war stock were in the 70s. You know, they were very high. And in the post-war stock, the newer buildings, they were around 55%. So when I get to that 62% median, I'm taking conservative figures and boiling it down to that as a starting point. Now, if we stayed at 62% all along, that would have, I think, been fine, because we do have units that came out of rent control and into stabilization, and maybe they should have gotten a little bit more of an increase, which would bring the ratio down a little bit. But then again, 1969-70 was 48 years ago. I think we're approaching the 50th anniversary, right, in 1919. So the stock clearly has aged, and the composition has changed. So if those numbers went up over time, it wouldn't bother me that much if we were around at 64 to 65. And according to staff reports, which I think are very reliable, we're now at 58.3%, which means there's been a significant rise in net operating income, regardless of the point you use from 1990. 1990, you know, they say it was a bad time. I don't know, you know, there was a bit of a recession, but not a huge recession in terms of the incomes that owners were experiencing. People still needed housing. They still had to pay rent. And the only slump I remember that was starting at that time was a decline in co-op conversion. But I don't recall a specific decline in profitability based upon the information that we had at the time. If they want to make the claim that owners were in bad shape in 1990, then they ought to put up the numbers. And if they haven't put up the numbers, I wouldn't trust it. And if they have put up the numbers, I would examine it closely.
But the analysis that you gave, which I'm not necessarily challenging, but it's a little ad hoc. It was just like, you know, well, in the 60s, you know, the ratio is this, and in the 80s, the ratio is that. What kind of objective metric should we be using? Should we be looking at operating costs across the nation in other markets, or what's the right?
I don't think that you can look across other nations, because other, you know, areas, other major metropolitan markets, because New York is very unique. And those are unregulated, and in some of those markets, rents are highly skewed. I mean, there are movements afoot in California, Washington, and Chicago now to bring back rent regulation because what they perceive as excesses. In terms of arbitrariness, they're not really arbitrary. Taking the starting point of rent stabilization when rents were considered high in 1969-70 is not a bad thing. Taking 1990 is not arbitrary, only because that's the only time when we have reliable data for the first time with the income and expense stuff. So it wasn't, you know, created somehow to skew the numbers. It was given to us because that's the first time that we had that data. And I think that if they're going to say that the ratio that existed in 19, it was actually 91 when we first measured it, which was 63%. If they're going to say that that was a bad time, then I think that they would have to produce something from maybe the mid-'80s showing that it should have been much lower. And I doubt that they can do that. I don't think there was any significant change. So I think that, you know, by the staff's indications in terms of what we've seen since 1990, clearly 64% increase in net operating income after adjusting for inflation is very significant over that period of time. I don't know that there's any reason why owners deserve to have growing levels of relative profit. They certainly get growing profit, and they get growing profit, but after inflation, their numbers are going up greatly. But I don't even look at that 64% because baked into that is major capital improvements, individual apartment improvements, deregulated units, and so on, which I think are outside of the board's control. And I think the board should be looking at compensating owners for their changes in operating costs and making sure that it's not somehow whittling away at their net operating income over time, so preserve that against the effects of inflation. And when you do that, you see that what was necessary would have been a 156 or 157% increase. You see the column, the third from the end, goes to 256.81 from a base of 100. This is about a 157% increase. And now, looking at the board's rent index, the RGB rent index, which factors in the guidelines, the annual guidelines, as well as the vacancy allowances. Those increases have resulted in a 192% increase in rents. Now, the vacancy allowances are something that should be looked at as well, or at least noted, because the board did set vacancy allowances. I believe it was until 97, which I put in, so I think it was the Rent Act of 97 that took that discretion out. It was always my understanding that the vacancy allowances were kind of there to allow owners to catch up, typically when long-term tenants would leave, and they could catch up on the rents. It never had a great justification, but they were typically in the 5 to 10% range. And then with a conservative move in 1997, when a lot of things were changed in the system, the state imposed a statutory vacancy allowance, which is now about 20%, sometimes a little less, depending upon the difference between the 1 and 2 year guidelines. So that's locked in by statute. Now, somebody could argue, and the owners could argue, well, the reason why they did that is because they wanted the stock to move away from rent stabilization, so that as units became vacant, they got closer to market and that sort of thing. And that was certainly the purpose of high rent deregulation. But I don't think there's anything convincing out there that tells me that that was the purpose of the vacancy allowance. I think they just got complaints from owners that, oh, the big problem was these long-term tenants, they're in there for a long time. So they coupled that increase in the vacancy allowance, locking it in with a longevity bonus. So that's why you see not only the 20%, but if somebody's been in there for, I think it's 6 or 8 years or more, they get 0.6% for each year that the prior tenant has been in there. So I think it was really a way to make sure that owners caught up with the losses due to long-term tenants. But I think that if the board had stayed very close to its mandate, and I think the mandate essentially boils down to trying to simulate a normal market where we don't have a normal market, it's driven by scarcity, I think the rents would have been significantly lower. And I don't think that's something that, I would say this board is responsible for, but I think there were greatly excessive rent increases between the last, 5 to 10 years back. And that really skewed the system. And it does create hardship. Now, frankly, there's hardship in the world. There are people who have low incomes. Incomes, are flat this year. And we live in a country where 1% of the population, from the most credible evidence I've seen, holds almost twice the wealth of the bottom 90%. I mean, to me, it's obscene, and I don't know why people are not more militant in opposing that. It seems as though when a few voices come out of the, into the forefront and talk about that fundamental issue, they get drowned out or derided as radicals or whatever, and then we go back to the nonsense about, you know what the nonsense is. You see it all over the news every day. But that's the big issue, but that's not going to be resolved through rent regulation. That's going to be resolved through tax policy, fiscal policy, and so on. And I don't believe it's the purpose of rent regulation to make every unit affordable. I don't think it was the purpose of the American Revolution to lower taxes. It was the purpose of the American Revolution, which was kind of a post hoc rationalization to secure accountability over power and to establish certain rights for certain people. And I think that perhaps to a degree, the rent stabilization system is premised upon a rationalization, but it's a good rationalization. And that is that tenants should not be forced to pay excessive rents in a way that preserves and protects windfalls to owners who are benefiting from a market that doesn't operate normally. This is not a graceful tango between supply and demand, like you might find in the, bread market or the bicycle market or automobile market. This is like two sumo wrestlers, need and greed, and it takes democracy to referee the two. And this board is sort of in the middle of that. And I think if this board does its job, then it tries to keep owners whole, because in a normal market, as operating costs go up, rents go up. And it tries to protect their net operating income, because in a normal market, you have to have some kind of an income to justify your participation in the market. But if you look at it, and we don't have precise numbers, increases in the value of rental buildings in the city, it's still a great investment. Rent stabilization, the whole scheme has not really harmed these folks. And in fact, during the recession, it was probably the best investment anybody could have, except perhaps precious metals, because their incomes were protected. But again, I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and I know I cover some of the same ground every year, but I guess I feel like I outside of this process and the more informed people who really look at this in detail, there's a tremendous amount of misinformation. And, there are public relations campaigns that come up. We have the rent laws being renewed in Albany again. And they're going to throw out all the same nonsense about, it's going to lead to abandonment and supply is going to decline and so on and so forth. And the historical evidence on that is that it's just nonsense. In the city of New York, two greatest housing booms the city's experienced were in the 20s and in the period following World War II through the mid-60s, both times when strict rent controls were in effect. And we haven't had significant abandonment for decades, and that abandonment occurred in cities as pervasively and severely in cities without rent regulation as with rent regulation. And by and large, as you know from the staff's own studies, owners are doing very, very well, and tenants are not doing well. If it were the case that tenants were really doing well, I'd probably do some kind of other law practice, and I wouldn't, do these kinds of appearances and spend my time making these submissions. But they're not doing well. There are a lot of people hurting out there, and they're hurting for reasons which involve what I think is a fundamental injustice. So I don't expect you to protect everybody and make every apartment affordable, but I do think there is overwhelming evidence that a further rent freeze would be justified. Now, I know the optics of these things are not always good. The owners are going to say, well, we got a 4.5% increase in operating costs, and look what they're doing to us. They're just taking our money away so that they can, turn us into a welfare agency and so on. I think the board has to be vocal and say, no. The overwhelming evidence is that owners are doing very well. They're doing better than they've done in decades, and a rent freeze is not going to significantly add to any of the city's problems, and it will certainly benefit people who really need it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Collins? No. Thank you all very much. Appreciate your testimony.